So welcome all to a QUT Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies mini Zoom. Today it's all about the ATO statistics on deductible gifts for the year 2017-2018. The Queensland University of Technology acknowledges the Turrbal in Niagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respects to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. Hello, I'm Myles McGregor-Lowndes, the inaugural Director of ACPNS, and been reporting on tax giving statistics annually for about 30 years now. The ATO annual statistical report includes tax deductible gifts claimed by individual taxpayers, not companies or trusts, so the figures won't include corporate sponsorships, raffles and unclaimed donations. But we have records going back to 1978, so it's quite a history. A big shout out to the team at the ATO Tax Stats for all their assistance and improvements made at our suggestions over the years to reporting on charitable giving, and to Mari of ACPNS for crunching the data so professionally. Today we will overview the 2017-18 tax year. Wednesday and Thursday of this week will focus on private and public foundations. Today I'll make a few general comments and be followed by some real luminaries. Sarah Davies of Philanthropy Australia, Katherine Raskob of FIA, David Crosbie of Community Council of Australia, and our special overseas guest at almost midnight in the US, Patrick Rooney, the absolute guru of US giving statistics there. And it's a real pleasure to have you here, Patrick. Thanks for making the effort. So there are executive summaries, full papers, interactive lookups of individual postcode giving, occupation giving. It's all on our website. But feel free to use the Q&A icon on the bottom banner to ask any questions as we go along. We'll be going at a swift pace. So there was a 7.6% increase in deductible gifts, 3.75 billion with an average taxpayer gift of $845. But the more important figure to watch is the median. Thanks to the ATO's tax statistics, we now have this for the last couple of years, and it increased this year slightly to $115. The concerning figure is the drop in the percentage of taxpayers claiming a gift. It's been falling since about 2011. On your screen's right is a graph of the amount donated by income, with those over $1 million at the top. All other income bands fell off this year except high income earners, which increased. I think this may be a warning sign for future years, particularly if the GFC 2007-2009 years are repeated. This is tempered by much of the high net worth gifts go into foundations for future distribution. So deductible gift recipients may not see an immediate drop due to the high net worth decreasing their gifts during the COVID incident. On the top left is the average of those over $1 million. And you can see in the years that it has fluctuated wildly. At the bottom shows the drop in participation for each income band between 2007 and 2018. And you can see that there is a significant drop-off in high net worth individuals. Now, it's over there. There's much more on our website and in the papers. You can have a look at individual postcodes, states. Western Australia is a state to have a look at. I think it had a large gift to a foundation during the year that was claimed. There are large gifts by states, gender, there's foundation giving, and where foundations distribute to. But now over to the sector peak CEOs for their takeaways. So over to you, Sarah Davies of Philanthropy Australia.
Thank you, Myles. And I have got two questions. I've been asked to answer two questions. Why are these stats important and how do we use them? Well, the first one, why? The quality, the extent and the longevity of this data gives us so much insight to Australian giving patterns and allows us to interpret patterns motivations, and to predict future behaviour, which is utterly critical. And I just want to take my hat off in huge gratitude to the team at ACPNS and QUT for their commitment to this space and to doing this work for all of us, which we get for free and then we can use as we need. And in a kind of post-truth fake news world, having trusted data that gives us a map of where we've been, where we are now, and shows us insights to a pathway on where we want to go is utterly precious. So it's the only real empirical data that we have about tax-deductible giving in Australia. It gives us essential insights to consumer behaviour, donor behaviour. It enables us to make informed judgments about motivations, influences and drivers of giving, and importantly, to help us predict what might happen in the future. In terms of how we use it, well, the first thing we do is we try and promote it and share it, and put out a shout out to media, to our members, to interested parties, to really try and understand what's happening and the criticality of giving, and then the importance of this data in understanding it. But more than that, we use it to inform our policy and advocacy work for the sector. So our purpose is to serve the community to achieve more and better philanthropy. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of why we've been waiting for this year's report, and how we are going to use it. The first one is obviously in relation to the pandemic and the economic fallout. So we are all considering and thinking about what COVID-19 is doing to giving, and we're going to hear from Katherine. The FIA has done some great research into predicting giving and fundraising trends, but it's really important that we intervene deliberately to try and maintain giving and to try and maintain individual regular giving, because the cost of losing those donors to the charity sector is not just the dollar cost, but it's actually the opportunity cost and the cost of re-engaging them when they choose to come back. So the second piece of policy work that we're doing at the moment is we are developing a blueprint on how to grow philanthropy in Australia long term. And this data and these patterns are utterly essential to us to be able to build a case that underpins the strategy. So like with the COVID-19 question and the long-term blueprint, if we're going to be making policy suggestions to government, as we are, about how to maintain giving and how to keep incentivising giving, we must have an evidence base and a fact base that supports our propositions. So one of the policies that we, along with many of our colleagues in the sector, are promoting to government is a temporary increase in the tax deductibility incentive for giving for regular donors. We're suggesting anywhere between 120 to 150% for this tax year and potentially for next tax year, to try and keep donors engaged with the charities that they want to support. And if we didn't have this kind of data over the long term, then making that case would just be even harder. And the third way we're using this data at the moment, and it's why we were so keen for this to be released this week, is that we are working on seeing whether we can actually craft an economic case for philanthropy. Is philanthropy treasury efficient? So the tax deductions that the government gives, the income forgone that the government gives to encourage giving, and the tax concession environment within which philanthropy operates, is that treasury efficient? So can we make a case for the more of those incentives Treasury is prepared to put forward, the greater the giving and therefore the greater the outcome? And looking at macro and micro contribution of giving and philanthropy needs a really robust evidence base, and that's what these stats give us. So thank you very much, Myles. That's why I think it's so critical, and just a snapshot of how we use it.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Over to Katherine of FIA.
Thanks, Myles. One of the things that surprised me when I joined FIA in the sector is the realization that despite how critical the charitable sector is in Australia, so critical to the fabric of our community and our society and indeed our whole country, there's a real lack of data which helps charities and fundraisers in particular to sort of plan and achieve their goals on behalf of their beneficiaries. So we're really lucky to have the ACPNS and QUT data, which will make a big difference. And also, in general, the great body of research that ACPNS had, on behalf of the sector is really terrific. But I guess for us in the fundraising sector, it's really important to consider these stats and this data in planning for the coming year, and in particular, as Sarah mentioned, the impact of COVID and what that means, and how can this data be used for thinking about 2021 and beyond, when we know there will likely be a big hit to fundraising income. So, thinking particularly about potentially regular giving and major gift fundraising, where tax deductions may be a larger contributing factor to giving in Australia, and how we can sort of plan for what the future might look like in terms of using the tax stats. So that's really terrific. Of course, it's worrying that the percentage of Australians making deductible gifts has fallen every year. So, it's great that the average gift size has increased, but that is a worrying thing for us. And as Sarah said, just keeping regular donors and major, regular givers is always so challenging. So that's, an area to consider. But I also think that fundraising organizations can potentially use the stats on tax deductibility to help drive, I guess, more people to give. Not in an overt way. We know we don't, talk a lot about, you can definitely have this tax deduction, but maybe in more creative, understated ways that can entice Australians to use the giving opportunity as the tax benefit, and sort of, ways of, sort of creative ways to sort of capitalize on those potentials and drivers for increased giving. In some ways we're lucky, because I know that in the US and maybe Patrick will talk about this, but charities have taken a huge hit in terms of charitable giving with their recent tax reforms, which don't allow their taxpayers to itemize deductions to charities on their tax return. So luckily we don't have that situation, but to Sarah's point, are there ways that we can use this data to ask for increased tax deductibility during and after COVID? And like Sarah, a number of the peak bodies have asked for an increase in this tax deduction for the future, which might help, and having the data will make a difference. Also, I'm intrigued, coming from a marketing background, on the opportunities for segmentation and targeting in fundraising, because having the detailed stats on, state and postcode giving can really assist fundraisers with those kinds of data opportunities for segmentation and better targeting. And we know that, from a best practice standpoint, tax receipting provides additional opportunities to achieve best practice in fundraising, particularly in the area of not just the sort of the receipts themselves, but also in the area of supporter experience, thanking donors and taking these opportunities to report on outcomes and impact more fully because of the increased opportunities around the tax deductions. So I think those are all really critical areas for fundraisers to consider in planning for the coming year, and in dealing with the major impacts of COVID on fundraising income into the future. So I'm so grateful again that ACPNS and QUT have done this work. I know, looking at it, it seems absolutely incredible the amount of work it takes to get to this state, and any research and data, to Sarah's point in terms of how important that is for the sector, is so critical for us in terms of operating into the future. So thanks, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat with you about it.
Thank you, Katherine. Over to the inimitable David Crosbie.
Hi everybody, and hi Myles and Sarah and Katherine and Patrick. Myles, can you go back to the graphs, the 3 graphs? I want to start by acknowledging that I'm on Ngunnawal land where I am at the moment, and I pay my respects to elders past and present on lands wherever people are. And I feel as though Sarah and Katherine have said a lot of what needs to be said, but I just want to again emphasise what a national treasure Myles and the ACPNS are. I don't know where we'd be without this kind of actual data. And it's incredibly useful as an advocate for policies for charities. My go-to information about levels of giving in Australia is the ATO data. And not because, on its own it tells you anything, but, and it does tell you things on its own, but it's that trend data which is so interesting over time, and the level to which you can dig into it. And I really like the postcode analysis, the occupational analysis, the sort of in-depth analysis that Myles and the team have been doing for many years. Like Sarah, the Community Council for Australia relies on this and calls on it in a lot of the work we do. So I can't emphasize how invaluable this data is. But I just want to give one example from this kind of, these three slides. So when you look at the first one about donated by income, you kind of think, oh, hold a sec, are the millionaires giving more? Or are there more millionaires? And it's only when you move to the next chart 38 that you realize actually they're not giving more than they were back in 2007 or 8 or even 14, 15, but they're giving significantly. So we both have more millionaires and we have more giving more, which accounts for the increase in the orange part of the coloured graph. And in terms of where we are now, I look at that chart 35 and I think that's the most salutary kind of bit of data that we've got about pandemics and charitable giving, because I've seen the data prior to 2008-9, and there was an increase year on year, as I recall, Myles, in terms of levels of giving for some time, and there was quite a consistent pattern. And then it hit 2008 and 9, and suddenly you see this drop off, and you can see it in various graphs about levels of giving by individuals. Our population's been growing, so you'd expect the amount that we're giving to grow. But if you look at percentages being given by groups in chart 35, you can see that we're still below where we were in 2007 and 8. And the simple answer is that the GFC hit and consumer confidence went through the floor. And when you look at that chart, we still haven't recovered to pre-GFC levels of giving by individuals. And it highlights the extent to which the tail of impacts on consumer confidence and spending stretch out over many years. In this case, I think over a decade. We started to get back towards an increase in 2014-15 and then dropped away again, then we've come up again, but we're still not back to pre-GFC levels. So you wonder what this kind of graph's going to look like when we have pre and post pandemic levels of giving. And you would expect, all other things being equal, the same kind of drop-off and sustained drop-off for a period of time. Now, that doesn't mean we can't change that, but it does set us a challenge, and it does create a framework in which to position our policies and our arguments and the work that we do, because we know the kind of impact that major financial hits have on charitable giving. So there is lots of information in this report. There's lots of charts. All of them have stories to tell. If ever I'm confused, I always ring Myles, because he always explains to me why I'm wrong or right. And it's great having that resource, and I think we're very lucky in Australia. I still think of Myles as a national treasure, and this work totally invaluable to the work of us as advocates and as a charitable sector in Australia. So thanks again, Myles, and everyone at the centre.
Yeah, so I'm Patrick Rooney from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. One of the things I have a couple statistics from research we've done I wanted to go into, but preface it to say that some of our research parallels what's going on in Australia, in that we have seen for the last decade a decline in the participation rate in private philanthropy, and we've also seen a change in the sense of, while the percentage of households giving has gone down, those who are giving, their gifts have gone up, and there's been a greater accentuation on giving by high net worth and ultra high net worth households. And so we see some very similar patterns both in both countries. And I'm not sure I have a good causal explanation for that, but it's an interesting parallel. The independent sector, which is the top kind of lobbying organization for the United States, sponsored our school to do research on 5 different policy options that might increase household giving in the United States. Now, keep in mind that the tax regime in the United States is quite different from than that in Australia for charities generally. And as Katherine mentioned, the tax change that President Trump and the Republicans brought in they passed in late 2017 and went into effect in 2018, had a deleterious impact on giving. Estimates range between 13 billion and 20 billion or more. And so IS commissioned us to look at what would be some options to stimulate giving. And so one was a universal charitable deduction, and that is much like what you have in Australia in many ways. Another would be a charitable deduction for all households with a cap of $8,000 for couples filing jointly. Another proposal we looked at was looking at what would happen if you only got half of the deduction for gifts of 1% of your adjusted gross income or less, and then the full deduction for gifts of 1% of AGI or more. The idea was that would push people to give more than 1%. And then there was another analysis of a 25% charitable tax credit. So if you donated $1,000, you would get a credit against your tax liability of $250. And the advantage of that would be that regardless of your income, regardless of your wealth, the value on your tax returns of your charitable gift would be the same for all households. So that would be a much more progressive reform. A universal charitable deduction would be a big step forward, but a universal charitable tax credit would be an even bigger step. And then lastly, we looked at this option that's, I think, so convoluted it'll never happen. But the idea was that for lower income households, they would get to deduct 200% of a charitable gift. Middle class households would get to deduct 150%, and higher income households would get to deduct 100% of their deduction. So again, it would be to stimulate low income households to give more and reward them for giving. Next slide, please. And what we found was that there were differential effects. The key thing was that the universal charitable deduction had a positive effect. It increased the number of donors almost 8% or over 8%, and the amount of charitable giving by almost 8%. The universal charitable tax credit of 25% had the biggest impact. It increased charitable giving by 10.8%, and charitable donors, the number of donors, by 12%. The only downside to the tax credit, the 25% tax credit, is it had the biggest treasury revenue loss of almost 1%. So what's important is that each of these had a positive stimulative effect on giving. Each of them would be more fair than what's going on today, and each of them would increase not only the total dollars, but also the total number of donors pretty substantially. Politically, one of the things you have to look at is what are the compliance costs for individuals and the administrative costs for the IRS, the Treasury, and those would vary quite a bit. On that basis, you could make an argument for a 25% tax credit being the simplest in many ways to negotiate and to understand and implement. But I think it's fabulous that, Myles, you have all this years of data and the great collaborations going on with the professional associations and the government. And, I think that's really fascinating to see these same patterns, so many thousands of miles apart and so many time zones apart, and similar philanthropic patterns across all these different types of business cycles and differences in tax codes as well. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Patrick. We've got just a few minutes. Panel, I noticed that one of the questions that one of the pundits had asked is why there had been a fall in people participating in tax giving. I think we might go around the field see if we've got any comments, but my sense is that wage stagnation here in Australia has made, for many, giving is a high discretionary spend, and it's fallen off. Those who are into planned giving, and this is why we push planned giving at the centre so much, are still in there. But I suspect it's a high discretionary gift people who have fallen out because of the straitened times. But over to anybody else to give their views.
It may not be a causal relationship, but one of the things we've seen in the United States is that if you go back to, we have data from the 1974 from the Filer Commission, and we have parallel type of data going from 2001 through fairly recently. And one of the things we've seen is that each generation is less likely to give at all than their parents and their grandparents. And that holds both for giving to congregations of all types, mass mosque, synagogue, all types of congregations, but also to secular charities like education, health, human services, and so on. And so I don't know if you looked at the differences in giving by generational cohorts, but we were able to look at it at the same point in life cycle, and we see it as very steady pattern that each generation is giving less. Now, those who give are giving similar amounts at that same point in life cycle, but that might be part of it if that you have the same phenomenon going on there.
Sarah, you had something?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Patrick, and it would be great to see if we could pull some of that age data out of our stats. Katherine's probably done more qual research than I have, but based on some of the research I've been involved with, there were a couple of strong influences on individual giving now. So I'm not talking planned and structured, I'm talking the more kind of reflexive, instantaneous giving. One is how people feel really matters. So it's not necessarily an objective assessment. It's, do I feel certain? Do I feel that I've got enough? Do I feel confident about then giving something up? So if in times of uncertainty, so it makes sense, David, that we saw a big drop off after the GFC, and when people are feeling uncertain or with levels, even low levels of anxiety about what's going to happen economically, then that sense of, well, I just need to keep it for a bit longer. So how people feel really matters. And there has been some data, and I don't know how robust it is, that suggests that actually there's some substitution happening. So people's purchasing decisions are changing. So if I choose to purchase, say, products where they promote that a percentage goes to charitable causes, am I substituting my giving for my consumer behaviour? So there has been some work done around that kind of, corporate branding around contribution of profits and perhaps a bit of a substitution element. I don't know how significant they are, but there are a couple of interesting sort of qualitative themes that have come through some of the research.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll pass over to Katherine, but another thought is that non-DGRs, those that haven't got DGRs, people are giving to them more and not requiring the tax deduction to go with it. So over to you, Katherine or David.
Yeah, I think just quickly, all three of those things that were mentioned. One is that feeling that Sarah suggested around confidence in the environment and the economy and everything else that contributes. And some of our research does show that when people feel they have more money, they give more, even if they really don't. Just that feeling that they've actually got some more money. And that's why I think some of the trends during this COVID period in the very early page where there was sort of feeling a bit insecure, but they actually did have a bit more money, may or may not have played out into what they were giving. So there's that. And, I think in the last thing, we obviously represent registered charities. who have, the majority who have tax deductible DGR status, but I think there is an increase in giving in other avenues, and including in the sort of GoFundMe pages of the world that are capturing the attention and the giving of some younger generations as well.
David, any final last word?
Well, I think there is an argument that planned giving has stayed fairly stable, although the cost of acquiring donors has increased. Everyone I talk to is talking about how much they have to invest to get the same return. And I think it's an interesting point about fundraising. I mean, what does the fundraising dollar cost for an organisation to raise? I agree with what everyone else has said. I think all that analysis is right. The only other thing I'd add in is that Australians aren't as good at planned giving as some other countries, partly because we don't have any kind of death duties or taxes when on estates when we die. But I also think we're quite good at the kind of crisis funding. And even talking to some of the charities who are members of ours at the moment, they've raised more money than they have previously in the last few months. And there is quite a strong theme within Australian giving where when there's a crisis, that kind of, I think of it as the Banjo Paterson pass the hat around when someone's house burnt down, or, there's an old history of struggling in a difficult land and we're all in it together and bad things can happen. So when bad things can happen, we help each other out. And I think there's still an element of that to a lot of the giving in Australia where, when there's a crisis, when there's bushfires, when there's floods or, major events, our giving, our episodic giving can be quite significantly increased, more than in years where that doesn't happen. So I think there's almost a mapping of natural disasters that could be overlaid as well.
Thank you, David. I'm going to bring this mini Zoom to a conclusion. Please thank all our panellists, particularly Patrick, who stayed up late at night in the land of Trump and all odds things. So thank you, Patrick. We appreciate bringing your expertise, and all the other panellists, and for the questions that were asked online. You can get all this and more on our website and papers, and please feel free to use that. You're welcome to join us tomorrow for private and public foundations, and thank you very much, everybody.